All right, if you have your Bible with you this morning, I'd like you to open it up to the book of Psalms, as we've been doing here in this study. And I'd like you to join me in Psalm 90. This is now week number 5 here in our study of the attributes of God. I'm not sure how much we'll get done here today because we are starting a little bit late. But each week we have been examining a new attribute. And I hope that you see that each one is really building on the previous one that we've talked about. And actually, it's hard to talk about any of the attributes without relating to all of them in one way or another. That's the point that we noted last week when we looked at the Shema of Israel from the book of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one. God is one in being. He is one in substance. All of God's attributes look like different things to us, and we experience them as different things, but really in God, they are one thing. All of His attributes are one thing. Now, that's hard for us to comprehend as human beings because as human beings, we are complex creatures. And by complex, I mean we're made up of parts. We are part body, we are part soul, we are part love, part wisdom, part so on and so on, okay? But God is not that way. He does not partake of all of these things as if they exist outside of His being, and He draws upon these things. He is what those things are. So God is love. He is light. He is wisdom. He is power. He is goodness, and He is those things to their full capacity. Okay? Now, in order to build this up, we've been looking at one attribute at a time. First, we said that God is perfect and limitless. There is nothing that exists outside of God. To even think of anything outside of Him is really just to think of non-existence. And really, non-existence is non-sense. It just does not make any sense to us. So we can't even really fathom non-existence, okay? So nothing can be bigger than God. Nothing can exist outside of God. He is the fullness of all those things that look like various attributes to us. From there, we talked about how God is independent. The Latin phrase for this is the aseity of God. God does not depend upon anything or anyone for His life. He is self-sustaining. He is self-existent. He is self-sufficient. Everything else that exists because God created it. And everything depends upon its existence, its continuing existence, by God's sustaining power. Then last week, we talked about the fact that God is simple and that He is changeless. Okay? And by saying that God is simple, we don't mean that He's simple to understand. That would be far from the truth as we're learning here in this class. But as we've already been saying, it means God is not made up of parts. He does not have some love, some wisdom, some power, some goodness. Okay? He is what love, wisdom, power, and goodness are, and in Him they are one thing. And because that is true, and because God is perfect in His oneness, that also means God cannot change. To change implies degrees of better or worse, right? And so if God changed for the better, that meant sometime in the past He was for the worse. And if God changed in the future for the worse, that means He's going from better to a worse position. Neither of those things can be true about a being who is eternally perfect in nature. God is forever constant in His perfections. But as we noted at the end of class last week, this kind of leaves us with a conundrum. And that's where we want to pick things back up in our class here today. When we think of changelessness, we think of something being static or inert, right? It doesn't move. For example, one of the great visual images of something that's changeless is a giant rock, right? In most cases, rocks do not move. They are stationary, they are reliable, and because that's true, they can be depended upon for certain things, including shelter and that kind of stuff. I remember summer before last when we went to Yosemite, we got to stand up on that high point and we got to see all the Yosemite Valley before us. And you got Half Dome there, and you have El Capitan. And it struck me that over 100 years before that, we were listening to this little narration on the GPS thing on the way up there, and over 100 years before that, Teddy Roosevelt had stood at that exact place. Now, he didn't ride a car up there like we did. He was supposed to ride a horse, but he was so heavy, the horse didn't factor. It wasn't, and so he ended up having to walk. So he hiked that whole way up there, which is amazing. It's like a huge elevation change. But he saw that exact same picture. Hadn't changed in 100 years, not the rocks anyways. And if you go back 100 years prior to that, you would have had the Indians that lived and thrived in that area, and they would have looked and saw the exact same thing. It's there. It does not move. It does not change. Now, we know technically it actually does change over time, right? But illustrations only go so far, so you understand the point of what it's trying to say. So often God is called the rock, right? The rock of our salvation. Why? Because he does not change. And since he does not change, he is that reliable shelter of salvation. But if we think about God's changelessness in this particular way, it presents a serious dilemma for it, doesn't it? Because it seems obvious to us, God does change. In the sense that God moves, he has action. And the reason we know that is because there was a time when the creation did not exist, but now it does exist. And God created it, and so that implies action, movement, right? So how can God be both changeless and yet acting as he appears to do? And so we ended class last week with a classification for God that comes in classical theology, and that classification is that God is pure act. Okay? But to understand pure act, we have to contemplate something about not only the changelessness of God, but something about the nature of time. And that is our subject here this morning. And I won't lie to you, it's going to be the hardest thing for me to talk about and for you to grasp, because it's almost impossible for us to get a hold of this. So the Bible begins this way. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the word that I want you to pay attention to is beginning. In the beginning of what? Well, it's not the beginning of God, because God has no beginning. He eternally is and forever has been. On top of that, creation could not come into being if there was not something that preceded it in order to create it. Okay? And so what is being accounted for here in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1 is the beginning of what we would call the space-time universe. This is creation as we know it, which is subject to space, which is subject to time, because it has mass and because it unfolds in a sequence of movements that are measurable. Okay? Now, here's where it gets really hard for me to explain and also hard to understand. Okay? Before that beginning moment from Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, where the space-time universe came into existence, there was no time. There was no before and no after. There was no better or worse. All there was God. As God says to Moses in the burning bush, I am. Now, that's pretty much impossible for us to think about, okay? Because we are creatures in time and we experience life sequentially, one moment to the next moment to the next moment, we actually don't even have the capacity to experience this, okay? Now, if you're like me, if you think about God before the beginning of creation, before Genesis 1:1, you probably think of him going backwards millions and billions and trillions of years. Everybody ever think about God in that particular way? And so basically, we're we're doing the reverse of how we think about our future. Okay, we know we're going to live forever and we're in heaven, and so we're going to go forward sequentially into the future going forward, okay? One moment after the next moment after the next moment and so on, okay? That's a little bit easier to comprehend. But what is almost impossible to comprehend is that the reverse direction does not work the same way, okay? To think about eternity past is not to go backwards in time millions and billions and trillions of years or to an infinite degree. When God created the heavens and the earth, time began. Before that, there just was. And that was God. Okay? But to use the word before is not even really the right word, because when we think before, we're just trying to think of, okay, 1 second, maybe even 1 millisecond before the universe exploded into being. There was not before. There simply was. And that is God. Now, is that confusing or what? Okay, so here we fall back on our dilemma. If God went from a being that was the source of existence, and he existed eternally and changelessly, and there was no time, how then did he move to create? Because that implies a sequence, right? And so here we come back to the theologian's concept of pure act. What the theologians will say is part of God's isness, his existence, is that he has always and eternally been acting. He's always been in motion. His motion never had a beginning, and it will never have an end. He contemplated all the effects of his creation in one eternal decree. Now, that has interesting implications. For example, this is neat. It means God has always had you in mind. There is never a moment in all existence when your name did not exist in the mind and contemplation of God. Now, there was a time when you didn't exist, 30, 40, 50, 70, 80, 90 years ago, okay? But there was never a time when God's thought of you, his contemplation of you, did not exist. And the good that he has intended for you has always been. That's staggering when you think about it. And so these are some of the things that you begin to contemplate when you start playing with the idea that God is changeless. He's outside of time, but his changelessness is pure act. Okay? But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here this morning, so let's read from our psalm, and then we'll try to flesh this out a little bit more. So Psalm 90, if you will. What this psalm is going to do is it is going to contrast God with us. It's going to talk about how God is our dwelling place. He is that rock, kind of like we were talking about just a moment ago. And without him, we could not exist. God is from before the creation of the universe, and but we, on the other hand, the psalm will say, are dust, and we will return to dust. We are sinful creatures, and because we are sinful creatures, we are under the condemnation of God, and that condemnation is death. And so, he will say, we'll live 70 years, maybe 80 if we're strong. Confirmation of what I said a few weeks ago, 80, it is old, right? Okay. But to God, 1,000 years, just like a day. Okay, just a short watch of the night. All right, that's comparing as we go. Let's read it together here. Lord, you have been our dwelling place. There's that rock, okay? You have been our dwelling place through all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world. Notice this, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. In contrast to that, verse 3, you turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or just like a watch in the night. And yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by the evening it is dry and withered. We are consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. All our days pass away under your wrath, and we finish our years with a moan. Our days may come to 70 years, or 80 if our strength endures. Yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. If only we knew the power of your anger. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is due you. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. And to that the church can say, Amen. So let's come back for a moment to this idea of pure act. There's a phrase here that I want to put in your mind, and it's probably one you've heard before, but it's helpful to memorize it and to keep it because it'll help you think about God. And the phrase is the unmoved mover. Anybody ever heard of that phrase before? Okay, a few of you. The theologian that brought this particular idea into common use in Christian circles was Thomas Aquinas. Okay, but it didn't originate with him. It actually is from Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher. And this is how the Greek philosophers conceived of God. They didn't have biblical revelation like the Jewish people did, so they didn't know him as he was and in his character. But they conceived of this being, which was the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover, and they did so by logic, by reason. Okay, and so here's the idea. Every movement has to have a cause, right? We learned that in physics. For example, if I was to be walking down the hallway after class and I trip over someone who's kneeling in the hallway, the cause of my tripping is their kneeling and perhaps me not paying much attention, okay? Well, the cause of them kneeling over is because their shoe is untied. And the cause of their shoe being untied is because they didn't tie it tight enough this morning when they were getting ready. And the reason they weren't tying it tight enough is because they were fighting with their spouse and they weren't paying attention on the way here, right?
Root cause.
I know that never causes anybody, that never happens, okay? All right, and so the reason that they're fighting is, and so on and so on, okay? Now, you can trace every single action in that way. Every movement has a cause, which has another cause, which would go back to infinity if there was not a first mover. Okay? That is why Aristotle and then Aquinas after him will say God is the unmoved mover. Aristotle realized that there had to be a being by necessity of logic who begins the sequence. And they themselves have to be uncaused. Okay? Otherwise it just keeps going back infinitely. Okay? The first mover cannot be a finite thing. It has to be an infinite thing, something that has always existed. The unmoved mover, the uncaused cause. Okay? So here then is how we do our best, and you can't conceive it fully, but here's how we do our best to reconcile the fact that God is changeless and yet also pure act. Okay? God is the first cause of everything that we see. No one can act upon him and move him, but he acts upon everything else and moves them. And because he is the first cause, that means he has eternally been in motion. There was never a moment, if you will, and that's not the right word because that's a time word, but there was never a moment when God was not moving in action. Okay? It is his eternal decree. He's always been moving. And because God is eternal and unchangeable, nothing causes God to move except for his own being. That's what Aristotle means when he says the unmoved mover. He's not acted on by some outside force. He's not impelled by anything. He is the self-moving force and has always been moving eternally. Okay? But the action he takes is one action, and it's forever the same thing. Now, that's both helpful and a little bit troublesome. It is helpful because as finite beings, we don't understand how God can be changeless, and yet the creation comes into being. But what we see here is it's part of his one eternal act. Okay? But where it gets confusing is, okay, but in regard to us, what about things like prayer? Doesn't God tell us that we can change things through prayer? Don't we see examples in Scripture of men and women of God who changed things in God through the course of prayer? And here again, we have to strike the balance between how God presents himself to us as finite creatures so that we can understand him, but then contrast how he is in his true nature, which is mostly incomprehensible to us. To steal a pun here, we can only touch the hem of the garment. Okay? It is very rightful to say that we change things through our prayer. It's important that we know that, or we would not pray. Even when we do know that, it's still hard to pray, right? It's a difficult discipline for us. But this is part of the mystery of a timeless being interacting with beings who are in time. In that one eternal movement it is, that one eternal decree, God factored in all of our decisions, all of our movements, all of our prayer. But since they have been factored in eternally, they are a part of that one eternal, unchanging decree. Now, if that doesn't make much sense to you, don't fret about it. To catch these things in one presentation in class, it's almost impossible. A person has to bear down on these things and do it persistently. And if you're the kind of person that says, you know, that's interesting, but I'm just going to have to take these things on faith, perfectly okay, because that's the way that it is. Just understanding that there are a few of us who want to press deeper into these things. Now, when it comes to timelessness, we run into the same problem that we encountered last week when Shelley asked us about evil. Okay? Augustine is very famous for saying, I know exactly what time is until you ask me to define it. Isn't that true? And the same thing is true in regard to evil. If I were to ask you, do you know what evil is? You would say, yeah, absolutely I know what it is. But then if I asked you to define it, you would not be able to define it positively. You would only be able to say what it is not. You would only be able to define it in the negative. It is not the good. But you couldn't actually say what it is. Okay? Same thing is true when you talk about time. If I was to ask you, do you know what time is? You would say, yeah, of course it is. Of course I do. 11:42, that's right. That's what time it is. Okay. But if I were to ask you to explain what is time, all of a sudden, I don't know exactly how to do that. And what we discover as we press into these things is that you cannot define eternity and timelessness by what they are. You can only define them by what they are not. You can only define it in the negative. And when you're talking about eternity and timelessness, you can only define it by three negatives. Okay? It means there's no beginning, there is no end, and there is no succession of moments. Eternity simply is. Always has been, always will be, presently is. And so as we end class here this morning, one of the things that's helpful for us is distinguishing the difference between everlasting and eternal. We are everlasting beings. That means we came into existence at a certain point in time, but we will always exist one way or another. Either we will exist in the presence of God or we will exist away from the presence of God, but you and I will always exist. But you and I are not eternal, because there was a point in time where we came into being. even though we are everlasting. God, on the other hand, is eternal. Be right there. He has no beginning, has no end, but always is. Yes?
And what was one of the first things that God created?
The heavens and the earth?
And what governs time for the earth?
That's right. It is the heavens.
It's the universe.
It's the universe.
Of the universe.
That's right.
That is time.
That is time.
And God keeps them in sync to the minutia.
That's right.
And I believe evil can be defined as an action. It is the positive action of the devil on our soul and our heart.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a book that is a very excellent book written by a friend of mine, Don Humphrey. It's available, I believe, on Amazon.
Okay.
And he goes through the steps that Satan uses to, this is written especially for addictions,
Yes.
but when you read it and you look at everything, the actions of people, the actions of nations,
Mm-hmm.
the actions of governments, you can see this same pattern of the action of Satan and his effect on it when you understand it and can have that defined for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's defined by what is not. I think it's very much defined by what is. And that is Satan. He is a very active force in the earth going to and fro. He's moving too.
Right. Well, what you're defining is its effect. But to say what the evil is it is a lack of good, a deficiency of good. That's the positive. You can define goodness, but evil is a lack of something. That's what I mean by the negative. So you can define it. I understand what you're saying, yeah. And that's exactly right. All right, well, I had some more stuff, but we are out of time. My wife reminded me there are people watching little kids, and they will be ready to go, so I'm not going to hold you any longer. And so thank you for your time here today, and we will see you next week.